George Foreman, Olympic gold medalist, two-time heavyweight champ, and one of the hardest hitters boxing has ever seen. But behind the knockouts and world titles, there was one opponent who pushed him to the edge, beyond strength, beyond skill, into something far more personal. This is the fight that changed everything. George Foreman is one of those names that sticks with you, whether you're a longtime boxing fan or a non-boxing enthusiast who just remembers him from TV. For some, he's the undisputed heavyweight champ who could end a fight with a single punch. Standing at 6'3" and weighing over 250 pounds in his prime, Foreman was a force of nature. For others, he's the friendly face behind grill commercials. He built a career that was both dominant and unforgettable. To truly understand how incredible George was back then, we have to look back at the path Foreman carved in the ring and why his name still carries weight today. One of George Foreman's most unforgettable wins was against Joe Frazier, knocking him down 6 times in just 2 rounds to become champion. He also faced legends like Muhammad Ali, Ken Norton, and Evander Holyfield. His 1974 bout with Ali, famously known as the Rumble in the Jungle, ended in defeat, but became one of the most historic nights in sports. It didn't take away from his legacy. It made it even stronger. When it comes to accomplishments, George Foreman's track record speaks for itself. He won an Olympic gold medal in 1968, became heavyweight champion in 1973 after dominating Joe Frazier, and decades later, in 1994, made history by becoming the oldest heavyweight champion ever at the age of 45. Over his long career, he racked up 76 wins, with 68 of those coming by knockout. This kind of success wasn't just rare, it was historic. Foreman fought across 2 very different eras and managed to leave his mark on both. Whether you're talking about titles, knockouts, or comebacks, George Foreman did what few in the sport ever could. Despite all the belts, all the knockouts, and all the big names he faced, there was still one fight that stayed with him. One opponent who made things feel different. And surprisingly, it wasn't who most people expected. For years, Foreman never spoke much about that night, maybe because it meant more than just boxing, maybe because it touched something personal. But when he finally opened up, the name he shared caught everyone off guard. Most people assumed it had to be Muhammad Ali, with all his clever tricks and sharp mind games. Others pointed to Joe Frazier, who never backed down and kept coming forward no matter what. Some were sure it was Evander Holyfield, with his constant pressure, smart movement, and the kind of stamina that made you wonder if he ever got tired. These were the usual names people expected. But when George Foreman was asked to name the toughest man he ever faced, he didn't pick any of them. Instead, he gave an answer that caught everyone off guard. And honestly, it's easy to see why those names came up. Foreman himself has said in different interviews that Ali, Frazier, and Holyfield were among the toughest fighters he ever faced. He's also mentioned Ron Lyle as the hardest puncher he ever went up against. But here's the twist. For all the famous names and hard-fought battles, when Foreman reflects on the toughest man he ever faced, it wasn't the one with the hardest punch or the biggest spotlight, but the one who truly left a mark. It's someone unexpected. Funny enough, it wasn't a title fight or a long-running rivalry. This opponent came from somewhere deeper, and when George finally revealed the name, it became clear. This wasn't just about boxing. It was about a moment that shifted something inside him. And that's what makes this reveal so interesting. But before we talk about who it was or what happened between them, we need to rewind. Not to the spotlight or championship belts, but back to Texas. where a young George Foreman was just another angry kid, fighting to be seen, with nothing but raw strength and a world to prove wrong. From street fights to gold medals, the rise of George Foreman. Born January 10, 1949, in Marshall, Texas, George Edward Foreman grew up in Houston's Fifth Ward, one of the city's poorest neighborhoods at the time. He was raised by his mother, Nancy Reeve Foreman, and his stepfather, Jerome Daniel Foreman. His biological father, Leroy Moorhead, was not present during his upbringing. George grew up in a crowded household with 6 siblings, making him one of 7 children. Life at home was tough. There was rarely enough money, the neighborhood was rough, and the future felt uncertain. By his early teens, George had dropped out of school and was already heading down a dangerous path, getting into fights and trouble on the streets. He later admitted that he was angry, restless, and didn't know where his life was going. His life began to change when he joined the Job Corps, a federal program created to help young people get back on track. It gave him structure, discipline, and a reason to focus. While there, an instructor named Doc Broadus noticed George's size and natural strength and suggested he try boxing. At first, he wasn't interested, but once he stepped into the ring and put on a pair of gloves, something clicked. The same energy he once used for street fights now had direction, and for the first time, it felt like all that fire inside him had somewhere to go. Boxing gave him purpose. By 1967, George was fully committed to boxing and climbing fast through the amateur ranks. Just 1 year later, he earned a spot on the United States Olympic team and traveled to Mexico City for the 1968 Summer Games. There, he fought in the heavyweight division and won the gold medal by defeating Soviet boxer Jonas Chipulis. But the victory was more than just a title. It was a powerful image. A young man from the streets of Houston standing tall on the Olympic podium with the American flag over his shoulders. He turned professional shortly after the Olympics, and his rise through the heavyweight ranks was fast and powerful. In just a few short years, George had built an undefeated record and earned a shot at the world title. In 1973, he faced reigning champion Joe Frazier, a fight that would become one of the most unforgettable moments in boxing history. George overwhelmed Frazier with raw power, knocking him down 6 times in only 2 rounds. That night, he claimed the WBA and WBC heavyweight titles and sent shockwaves through the boxing world. From that moment on, George Foreman wasn't just a rising star, he became a dominating presence in the heavyweight division. His size, raw punching power, and intensity made him one of the most feared fighters of his time. Opponents often looked uneasy before the opening bell, fully aware of the danger they were stepping into. Fans called him Big George, a nickname that matched both his frame and his ability to end fights in a flash. By the mid-1970s, his knockout streak had grown so strong that it seemed no one could stop him. However, it wasn't just his fights that got people talking. George Foreman was known for being quiet, serious, and sometimes distant. While other boxers made a fuss before fights and stirred up crowds, Foreman stayed reserved and focused. He let his fists do the talking. He rarely smiled in public and always seemed locked in intense focus. This calm, almost cold demeanor gave him a mystique that set him apart. He didn't just look strong, he looked unstoppable. To many, he wasn't just a boxer, he was a force. He had everything a champion could ask for: fame, fortune, and respect. But when the cheers faded, what was left? What was George Foreman really searching for outside the ring? George Foreman wasn't just the man who crushed Joe Frazier or stood tall with Olympic gold. He was more than knockouts and headlines. Behind the belts and the cheers was a man still searching for peace, for identity, for something deeper than the roar of the crowd. He had fame, he had a fortune, but something inside still felt unfinished. And it wasn't in the ring. It was in the private, unspoken moments away from the spotlight that the real story of George Foreman began to unfold. After his shocking loss to Muhammad Ali in 1974, George didn't fall apart. He stood on business, made adjustments, and came back winning. But something had shifted. The fire in his eyes and the intensity in his presence both felt different. For years, he had been the unstoppable force in the ring. But outside of it, he hadn't yet figured out who he really was. Boxing gave him a way out, but over time, it also became a mask. And now that mask was starting to slip. During this time, George started to pull back. The wins kept coming, and the headlines didn't stop. But something inside him was shifting. Those closest to him noticed it. He seemed heavier and more thoughtful, not physically, but emotionally. He wasn't the type to speak often, and while other fighters thrived in the spotlight, George stayed rooted. He showed up, did the job, and then quietly stepped away. By the time he faced Jimmy Young in 1977, George was already at a crossroads. The night in Puerto Rico would turn out to be his last fight for a long time. After the match, George surprised the boxing world by announcing his retirement. At just 28 years old, the undefeated powerhouse walked away from the sport at his peak. The reasons, however, went far beyond boxing, and that part of the story is one we're about to uncover. George stepped away from boxing and didn't return for nearly 10 years. He gave his life to God and became a born-again Christian. He was later ordained as a minister and founded the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ in Houston. He also opened the George Foreman Youth and Community Center to guide and mentor at-risk kids. This was the same man who had once grown up on rough streets, getting into fights out of pride and uncertainty. Now he was living with faith, serving others, and moving with a clear sense of purpose. It didn't end there. At home, a new chapter was unfolding. George had been married multiple times, but it was his fifth marriage to Mary Joan Martelli in 1985 that brought real stability. Together, they raised a large blended family with 12 children, 5 sons and 7 daughters. In classic George Foreman style, all 5 of his sons were named George, George Jr., George III, George IV, George V, and George VI. It became a running joke, but for George, it was about legacy, passing something on that would last. And while his daughters, Natalia, Leola, Frida, Michi, Georgetta, Isabella, and Courtney, didn't share the same name, they shared the same place in his heart. To George, family was the real prize, and the home he built meant just as much as any title he ever won. Outside the ring, George became someone more than just a former champion. He was a preacher, a father, and a symbol of redemption. The serious, intimidating fighter from his early years had softened. He smiled more and now connects with people. His transformation wasn't just about faith, it was about healing. He had learned to let go of anger, forgive genuinely, and, most importantly, he had learned how to forgive himself. By the late 1970s, George faced health issues, including concerns about his heart. But instead of pulling back, he leaned into life. He began focusing on his health, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. He embraced slower days, Sunday sermons, time with his children, and simple routines that kept him grounded. In a world that had once cheered his every punch, George found peace in things that did not need applause. Then, in 1987, 10 years after walking away, George Foreman returned to the ring. He was 38 years old, which is considered to be too old. He was heavier and no longer the intimidating force he once was. But he surprised everyone. With each bout, he showed there was still something powerful left in him. As the 1990s rolled on, he defied the odds and reclaimed the heavyweight title at the age of 45, making history once again. Finally, in 1997, George stepped away from boxing for good. This time, the decision did not come from a moment of crisis. It came from a place of peace. By the time he returned to the sport he once ruled, George was not chasing the past. He came back with a steady mind and a healed heart. He was no longer fighting for pride or recognition. Who was the one opponent that truly kept George Foreman on his toes? And what exactly happened that night to make him question everything? Now, he's finally opening up. Was it just a loss or something far more personal? The toughest man he faced. When a fighter like George Foreman looks back and names the one man who truly challenged him, it makes you stop and listen. This comes from a man who traded blows with legends, knocked out champions, and bounced back from defeats most couldn't survive. When he finally pointed to one opponent, not for the hardest punch, but for something deeper, you know it wasn't a casual call. It wasn't about titles or hype. It was the one fight that shifted everything. That night, Jimmy Young changed the game. The fight with Jimmy Young wasn't supposed to be a turning point. On March 17, 1977, in San Juan, Puerto Rico, George Foreman stepped into the ring, expecting another routine victory on his comeback trail. He weighed in at 226 pounds, strong, imposing, and still feared as one of the sport's most dangerous punchers. After his loss to Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle, he had bounced back with a brutal knockout over Ron Lyle and looked poised to reclaim his place at the top. Jimmy Young, though ranked, came in at around 213 pounds and wasn't viewed as a serious threat. He wasn't a champion, didn't have knockout power, and most expected him to fold under Foreman's pressure. But from the opening bell, it was clear. This fight wasn't going the way anyone expected. George entered the ring prepared for another knockout. But Jimmy Young came in light, fast, and composed. He didn't stand and trade. Instead, he slipped Foreman's punches with ease, circled the ring confidently, and turned the match into a chess game. From the early rounds, Young was setting the pace. He moved smartly, countered with precision, and refused to be cornered. Foreman kept chasing, but most of his punches missed the mark. The Puerto Rican heat only made things worse. Sweat poured down George's face, his breathing grew heavier, and frustration started to build. In the third round, he was even docked a point for shoving Young into the ropes, a sign that his rhythm was slipping fast. As the fight wore on, the shift became undeniable. The man who once dismantled Joe Frazier and Ken Norton with raw power now looked worn and out of sync. His punches slowed, his footwork dragged, and Young, sensing the moment, began to take over. In round 7, Foreman landed a big left hook that nearly dropped Young, but Jimmy stayed upright and fired back with clean, sharp counters. The crowd could feel it. Something was off. George wasn't just behind on points, he looked lost. Young, calm and focused, kept landing clean combinations and made sure Foreman never found his rhythm. For the first time in his career, George didn't look dangerous. He looked unsure. By the time they got to the 10th round, Foreman was drained and overwhelmed. He stumbled through what would become one of the most jarring moments of his boxing life. Young landed a clean overhand right, and for the first time, George Foreman went down. He beat the count and finished the round, but something had slipped, something deeper than just stamina or control. By the final bell, Foreman had landed 230 punches to Young's 209. But it wasn't just about numbers. The sharpness of Young's counters and the way he controlled the ring told a different story. The judges agreed: 118 to 111, 116 to 112, and 115 to 114. Jimmy Young had pulled off the upset. And just like that, George's comeback came to a grinding, unexpected halt. Here's where things get interesting. After the fight, as the cameras turned away and the arena emptied, George collapsed in the locker room. Medical staff rushed in. Some blamed the Puerto Rican heat. Others feared it was something more serious. But George later called it something else entirely: a spiritual awakening. He said it felt like something inside him had cracked open. That night wasn't just about losing a fight. It was about losing a piece of himself. For years, brute strength had carried him. But that night, it wasn't enough. And that truth hit harder than any punch he had ever taken. George walked away from boxing. He didn't just take a break, he retired. At the height of his career, with opponents still fearing his name, he stepped away from the sport that had made him a star. Instead of chasing belts, he turned to faith, family, and a life far beyond the spotlight. Looking back, Foreman never forgot that night. Because Jimmy Young did something no one else could, he didn't knock George out. He broke through him mentally, spiritually, and completely. Round after round, Young made him doubt the power that once seemed untouchable. He forced him to question everything: his rhythm, his belief, and his identity in that ring. That night was not just a fight, it was a reckoning, and it marked the beginning of George Foreman's transformation, both inside and far beyond the ring. So while many fans point to the Ali fight or Foreman's legendary comeback at 45, those who truly know his story understand that the real turning point happened in San Juan. Jimmy Young may not have been the strongest man George ever faced, but he left the deepest mark. Because sometimes, the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who throws the best punch. It's the one who makes you question your own strength. The one who makes you wonder if it's okay to let go. When a fighter meets your best with something sharper, calmer, and completely unexpected, it stays with you. And that's exactly what Jimmy Young did. But beyond the belts and the fame, what lasting legacy did George Foreman leave behind before the final bell echoed on his remarkable life? George Foreman's legacy is truly one of a kind. While most fighters slow down after their prime, George delivered not just one, but two unforgettable highlights in the ring. In his early years, he was a force of nature, a young, powerful knockout artist who stopped 40 opponents in a row and crushed legends like Joe Frazier and Ken Norton. At that time, he looked unbeatable. Beyond the ring, George became someone more relatable. His name reached households not just through punches, but through presence. The George Foreman grill turned him into a global icon, selling over 100 million units and giving his career a second life as an entrepreneur. He also wrote several cookbooks and children's books, showing a softer, more nurturing side that many didn't expect from a former heavyweight champion. It didn't end there. In 2002, The Ring magazine ranked him among the 25 greatest fighters of the past 80 years and named him the 9th greatest puncher of all time. The same man who once stared down opponents now smiled on talk shows. He offered fatherly wisdom and inspired millions with his story. He became a symbol of transformation, blending grit with warmth and strength with humility. And that's what made his legacy unforgettable. Unfortunately, George Foreman passed away on March 21, 2025, at the age of 76, surrounded by his family. But the legacy he left behind continues to shine. From Olympic gold to heavyweight titles, from soul-searching retirements to history-making comebacks, his journey was never just about boxing. It was about growth, redemption, and the quiet courage to begin again. Long after the final bell rang, George Foreman remains a symbol of strength, transformation, and a legacy that grows more powerful with every generation. Was Foreman truly the toughest heavyweight of the 90s, or does that title belong to someone else? Tell us what you think in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.